Hi, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to complete the Learning Journal. My name is Ron Vellon, and this journal that you're going to see today is for a leadership course, but all journals will have the same structure. And what we're going to do in this video tutorial is first give you a brief overview of the whole journal itself, just look at the three main sections, and then go back and show you each section, clarify what it's looking for, and give you a specific example of what A or A- level looks like so you have the best chance of success. So let's begin. The first couple of pages are descriptions that will feed into your self-evaluation for how well you're contributing in each class. So how you contribute will be detailed with using specific examples, which I'm going to show you what that looks like, so that you can see where are you contributing, where there are opportunities for you to contribute more, and help co-create a wonderful learning experience in the classroom. So here you're going to see some profiles, and these are not perfect. This just gives you a sense of what A-level contribution and participation look like, what is B-level, and so on. I encourage you to read this. There's no real value in me reading through the whole thing now, so read each one. You see on the first page you've got an A-level profile, B, then when we scroll down, there's a C profile, a D profile, and an F, which hopefully won't be even discussing. But this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that could be looked for when eventually you earn your final mark for that part of the course. Then in the first section right at the top, of course, you're going to put in your name here, your student ID, very simple stuff. And here you're going to assign a grade. So let's say you felt you did B+. So you just put in a B+ here. You're just going to type that in. I'm handwriting it in now, but this will get typed up. I don't use this to actually provide you the mark. What's more important is you use this to evaluate yourself. I have my own notes that I take and I track certain things, and that's how you earn your mark for this part of the course. You could write a C+ here, but if I think you're doing an A- or B+ level contribution, that's the mark you're going to earn. So don't think that it's somehow changing my thinking. By the same token, if you're not contributing consistently, or you're not as prepared, or you're not reaching that A level of contribution that perhaps you're thinking you would like to, putting an A in there and then not being able to back it up works against you from a point of view of the assignment. So be realistic. Once that's done, and again, use the guide in the previous 2 pages to help you figure out what that is, you provide some detail as to what you actually did in the period we're talking about. So journals will vary based on how many classes you're reflecting on. For the leadership course, it might be 5 or 6 classes, and other courses it might be 2 or 3. And in this section, you'll write down specific things you did as examples of how you contributed. When we go back through this, I'll show you some examples of what that looks like and be a little clearer about what this section is looking for. So that's the first thing you do. That's why I always encourage students to make notes for themselves right after a class, or even during a class, just to note when you've made a contribution so that when it comes to writing the journal, you don't have to try to remember. Students have told me that the biggest time suck on this is when they're trying to remember from a class 3 or 4 weeks previous. And so what ends up happening a lot of times, the journal entries here will look like they've only looked back a class or 2 because they haven't made notes previously, so they're probably missing things. Again, it's up to you to choose what you want to write here, but make it easy on yourself by making notes at the end of every class, just brief notes so that you can go back to it much more quickly. Then we go to the next section, and here we begin writing about the specific learning points. And I'll go through that in detail in a few minutes. So in this case, for this journal, for the period we're talking about, which is approximately 6 classes looking back, we're looking for 4 key specific things you've learned about leadership, and then there's some questions we'll look at in a moment. So that's done here in this section. These table spaces will expand as you write. So don't be concerned that they look small. You'll have plenty of space. Just keep typing in and the table will just expand. And then the third section, if we scroll down here a little bit further, we get to things you're learning about yourself as a person. And this is important because in this course, for example, this is a leadership course, we need to understand that who we are as people and who we are as leaders you know, there's a huge overlap there. You're bringing yourself into whatever role, whatever leadership role you have. So by learning more about yourself as a person out of context from being in a leadership role or any kind of other work or volunteer environment, you learn some other things about yourself that you realize you can infuse and apply in a leadership function. But first you have to isolate and be clear, but what am I learning about myself without putting in that leadership context? So that's the third section. Now we're going to look at each of the sections in a bit more detail and provide you an example of approximately A or A- level work so you understand what's expected. Okay, here we are back at the first section. And this is the one which is asking you about your contributions in the classroom. So when we look at this, we see that the question is specifically asking, first of all, how did you contribute to the effectiveness of the class since the course began? So this is the first journal in this particular case. And in the first journal entry, it starts at the beginning of the course. And again, like I said, depending on how many classes are involved, that's where you begin from. We want you to identify a minimum of 3 specific behaviors you demonstrated during classes. And this is where you need to include examples. This is a minimum. I can tell you that A-level work, there's more than the minimum included, but it doesn't mean you need to write 10. But if you want to get an A, you likely need to write minimum 3, maybe 4 or 5, depending on how detailed and specific you are. And once you've done that, you'll write a couple of paragraphs on what will you focus on doing better in order to more effectively contribute going forward. There is always room for improvement. Now, I know some students will tell me that they're more shy, maybe some level of introversion, they don't feel the energy some days. That's fine. Maybe you want to stretch yourself a little bit. This course is very reliant on students sharing their thoughts and ideas so they can learn from each other around whatever it is we happen to be working with that week. So what can you do more? If you don't want to raise your hand or say something in front of the whole class, maybe you can do more about participation in small groups or helping to organize groups or leading things in different ways. There's lots of options. And if, by the way, you're ever stuck with that, it's great for you to come and see me and say, I'm trying to do this or that, but I'm not really sure if this is helping to contribute. It's a great, easy conversation. I'm happy to help you improve if that's what you want to do. So that's what this section's asking for. This will expand as you write. It's designed that way. But sometimes tables, overlapping pages or whatever, don't worry about that. So that's it for this section. So let me show you an example. So here, this student wrote 4 specific things. And I'm not going to read them all. I'll provide the example for you in a separate document, but this is something you can read. If we look at the first one, for our first class, I contributed towards class discussion many times. I explained that bullying peers in a classroom can prevent someone from wanting to participate again in the future because most people have a primal need to be liked. I strongly believe in respecting others' opinions, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. This led to further class discussion about the terms ostracize and projection, and a bit of role play between myself and the professor. So this is a great example because they're actually talking about several things they did in a class, but they're using examples to illustrate how they actually did it. You don't need to write long paragraphs about what you did and, just use 1 or 2 examples just to give yourself a bit of a snapshot of what happened. In this case, they use 1 paragraph to talk about that particular cycle. They go on to use another example here, which you can read. I'll read 1 more. Here, it says, during the skills assessment discussion with my group, I confess that one of my biggest fears as a manager is to be disliked by my team. This sparked a conversation between me and Kathy. She let our group know that while I was sharing my fear, she realized she strongly dislikes her current manager, but never thought about how her manager must feel in a high-demanding job, and thanked me for changing her perspective. So that's another great example because she talks about how what she did had an impact on somebody else. This is not always going to happen. You're not going to always have immediate feedback like that, but this gives you a sense of what we're looking for. So try to describe specific behavior in its own paragraph. Don't shotgun in everything. In other words, don't try to talk about 3 or 4 things in one paragraph. That's very confusing. What we have here, and I want to really emphasize this, is depth and clarity. So again, specific, I'm just going to circle this word here because you can hear this from me a lot. Be really specific. In this case, this person has 4 entries. Then in the last paragraph, this person answers the second question, which is basically, what will you focus on doing better going forward? So here the person writes, moving forward for this class, I will challenge myself to share my opinion during classroom decision making. Although I was actively participating, I did not participate more than that when we discussed the tech problem during class. I felt like my opinion had already been mentioned and didn't want to say something that was repetitive and risk looking like a tryhard. I now realize, however, that if I had put my hand up and offered my opinion, it would have positively moved the discussion forward for our entire class. I will make sure I keep this in mind for the next couple of weeks. So for this section, I'd probably give it a pretty strong A-. For just this particular section. I don't separate it out like that, but that's an A- kind of level work. Would have been good to have a little bit more detail here to round it out, specifically how she's going to do it, or some detail here. Maybe there's some other things, but this is basically, in this particular example, the person's reflecting on essentially 3 classes. So if you're reflecting on 5 or 6 classes, you should have more here. But basically, this is what we're looking for. This person used bullet points. I also typically prefer to have a line space between paragraphs, and the reason is I'm reading this online, and it is just much easier to track. So at minimum, use bullet points so I know where one paragraph ends and the next begins. Don't blend everything into one big block of text, and or include a line space just to be sure it's crystal clear. Just makes life a lot easier, which I'm sure you realize since I'm sure you're reading a lot of things online as well. This next section, the second section as mentioned earlier, is all about the specific elements that you're learning that are important to you. And it's really critical in a journal that you're reflecting on what really matters to you in a very specific way. Otherwise, you're going to remember things in very vague notions, and you probably won't apply them going forward in ways that you might think you could. So in this course, we're looking for 4 specific things you have learned about leadership since the beginning of the course. And in other journals, it will say since your previous journal, but in this case, it's the beginning. So it's since the beginning of the course. Be specific and precise and use about 3 to 4 sentences approximately. It might take 5 or 6 to explain what they are. And I'm going to show you an example of what that is. And the first learning point will go here. Just start typing in. And again, each of these boxes will expand to accommodate whatever you're writing. Typically, 1 good paragraph is enough to do the job if you write it well. Sometimes students will write on and on in ways that start to become confusing and repetitive. So you're expected to edit this to make sure it's clear. That's, again, working toward an A-level mark or above. So 1 good paragraph, 3 to 4 sentences minimum is usually what it takes. And explain what the specific learning point is. I'm going to show you an example of what specific means. And in the second box here, you answer the second question, which is, then explain how each of these elements is significant for you and your learning as a leader. In this case, you do 1. So the first learning point goes here in this first box, and then the significance of this learning goes into this one. And then you move on to the second one below here. But first, answer everything you need to answer about the first learning point about leadership, then the significance of it to you and your learning as a leader, then you move on. It's just a lot easier. Don't try to jam things together. It doesn't work. Just do 1 at a time, do it well, then move on. Leave 1 line space between paragraphs. 4 or 5 sentences are what are called for here if you want to get close to answering this well on an A level. Sometimes it takes more. If you need to write more than 1 paragraph, as it says here, leave 1 line space between, just to make it easier to read. Make sense? I hope it makes sense. So let's now have a look at what a really great example of this is. As you can see here, Clearly, the person describes the learning point first. And this is a fairly lengthy paragraph, but fairly easy to read. The line spacing is provided for you. And let's read it together, and it gives you a sense of what we're looking for. The first thing I learned about leadership since my previous journal entry is that anyone who is giving feedback to someone should avoid ramping up. Ron explained that ramping up happens when people take so long to build on to what they are about to say to the other person receiving feedback that the message may end up being misinterpreted. I saw an example of ramping up when we watched the Thanksgiving episode of Friends. Ross was complimenting Rachel in hopes of preventing her feelings from getting hurt when he would eventually tell her that her dessert made using the wrong recipe. However, he took so long to get to the main point that Rachel misinterpreted the message, and he never got to give her the initial feedback he had in mind. So this gives you a sense of what we're looking for. There's some grammar issues here. So I would call this paragraph probably A-. And so that's something you have to check. So there's a couple of errors in here. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's from a content point of view on target with what we're looking for. So I would give this an A-, and that would become an A with grammar fixed. The next section talks about the significance of this learning point to you and your learning as a leader. As I showed you in the template, there is a sentence that you're going to start every single entry with. In fact, let me show you this one more time, if this all works the way it's supposed to. You'll see in the template this sentence, which starts every single time you talk about the significance. This is significant to me and my learning as a leader because. The reason why I want you to use that sentence every time you start the section on significance of a learning point is because it sets up your mind to focus in a particular way. This has been a lot of trial and error over the years, and I find that this leads to the best focus for this paragraph. Avoid generalizing, and you want to avoid saying things like one, as in one person, or you, or we, okay? Don't use any of those. We want I. It's all about you here. I. Okay? So let's go back to our example. This is significant to me and my learning as a leader because throughout my experience as a manager at work, I sometimes find myself in Ross's shoes. Even more so when I was a new hire. I ramp up the conversation in hopes of softening the blow for what I truly want to say when giving feedback. Sometimes I even start the conversation by saying, I don't want to be mean, but this wouldn't work well, obviously, because the actual feedback I had to give would not be mentioned, and the employee doesn't get a chance to improve, since I would be so worried about hurting their feelings. However, now knowing that ramping up does not add value to giving feedback because it is confusing and doesn't provide an opportunity for someone to learn something, I will be more cautious of my habits when doing this. Next time, I won't beat around the bush and instead directly invite the individual to a conversation built around providing support and growth to their role. This will better enable me to give feedback more effectively and contribute towards my developing and learning in becoming a successful leader. So this is quite complete. And this, I would say, the grammar is a little bit better. This is a strong A for this particular paragraph. And again, I look at the overall quality, not just paragraph by paragraph, but this gives you a sense of what we're looking for. Use this example to guide you. Separate out the specific learning, explain it. That's what you're really doing with this first section, is explaining it. Don't repeat. Edit for clarity. And that's for that section. Same thing applies for the second section here. Don't repeat yourself and edit for clarity. And in that way, you'll be on your way. And the best part is the learning you put down here, because it's important to you. And this is really important that you do this. You've got to talk about the things that matter to you. Focus on really specific things. In this case, the person talks about ramping up, which is a specific lesson about doing feedback well. Notice the person did not write, I learned all about the good things about giving feedback and rattle off a bunch of stuff. That's no good. That is C-level work. So focus in on the specific thing that matters to you or what you actually learned, one thing only at a time. Then flesh out its significance to you in the second section. And this section here will be much, much easier if you're really specific about the learning point. So that's the leadership learning. Let's now take a look at the third section where you talk about the learning you have about yourself. So it's the same kind of question, except it's just asking about learning about yourself. So a lot of the things we're going to do in our courses will bring out new insights about who you are as a person. And sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they may seem big, but most of the time they're small little things. So again, the specific number of entries we want to see here is provided, and in this case it's 2. Same structure, learning point, then the significance to you and your learning as a person. What 2 specific things have you learned about yourself as a person since the beginning of the course that are new insights for you? Again, this journal comes at a point where you're reflecting on your experience since the beginning of the course. Other journals will give you a different time frame. And for the personal learning, you can draw on your experiences in or outside of the classroom. What often happens when we're doing things experientially in class, that awareness, whatever we're working on that particular week, will carry over in students' awareness throughout the week between classes. And sometimes there's a new awareness. Maybe it has to do with how you relate to your friends, or it could be myriad ways this happens. So what are you learning about yourself that's really specific? Again, we ask you to explain how each of these elements is significant for you and your learning as a person, a human being. Explain one learning point and its significance completely, then move on to the next one. Again, line space between paragraphs. In this case, you have separate sections. Remember to include the statement, this is significant to me and my learning as a person because, and of course that's provided for you here so you have a place to start. Don't delete this. That's what's being asked for here. So what are we looking for? Let us show you an example again of A-level work. So here's an example for this exercise that was taken from. The example indicates a third learning as a person, but what we're looking for here is the content, whether it's the first or second. In this case, we're looking for 2. The example's taken where the journal was asking for 3 at the time. So that's why you have to pay attention to structure. It's a little bit different depending on which journal you're doing, but the basic content learning is what's important here. So the person says, the third thing that I learned about myself as a person is that I need to do a better job of actively listening to others. I find myself often only half listening to people, and I already start thinking about things that I want to say before they are finished speaking. This was brought to my attention recently because my girlfriend and one of my friends was getting upset with me because I had not listened to what they had said to me and then did the opposite of what they asked. I have also noticed that I tend to try to lead as a speaker in class, but I've noticed this recently and have tried allowing my other group members to speak, and I've also been encouraging them to share. So this is what I call kind of an A- description again. Pretty good. A couple little grammar things, but really the main thing is you want to be clear about what it is you're learning as a person. So what he seems to be indicating is that he's a little more focused on what he wants to say, and he needs to be more focused on listening to people more completely and balancing that out. And you don't get into the reasons why yet. That's in the significance later. But that's what we're trying to do. So he does this in basically 3 sentences or 4. I have to look here, maybe 4 sentences. And that's what we expect from you is to, what are you learning about yourself? Now, I want to point out here, there is a danger. I've been doing this a long time and read many journals, both in classes and through other work I've done outside of the university or college. And I'll tell you this. Sometimes students will write things like, well, what I learned in the past few weeks was that, I don't like to work on things by myself a lot. I really prefer to work on things with other people. It helps me focus. That's the kind of learning, given where this course sits as a 4th-year course, and given the experience of the student, they probably already knew. And it's easy to tell because it's difficult for them to come up with something specific about it that's occurring for them right now. So Don't discuss things you already have learned or what you already know. We're looking for new learning. It's okay if you discuss something that's a new learning based on an old learning. So let's say you've always known that not listening is detrimental to your friendships and your working relationships. As people tell you you're not listening, maybe they think you're selfish or something along those lines. And maybe there's a new learning, and you realize in the time frame of the journal that there's a reason why you find yourself not listening. It dawns on you that you want the same thing that everyone else wants, and that is you want to be heard. And you want to be heard so much that it blocks you from listening when, in fact, listening is the thing that needs to happen. So maybe you explain how you came across that learning during the time frame of the journal. In that case, you're building on something you know about yourself, which is typically what happens anyway, and allows you to write about something you're actually learning that's new, which is that motivation in this particular case. Now let's look at the significance and what the person wrote there. This is significant to me in my learning as a person. Again, that sentence is always going to be there because it affects my relationships with others when I don't actively listen and likely makes them feel less important. As I previously mentioned, my family and friends are extremely important to me, and all people in general are important to me, so I don't want to make anyone feel as though I don't care about what they are saying. Additionally, it is also important for me because it will also help me learn more by fully understanding what everyone else is saying and by being able to retain different perspectives. I think a common reason I do this is because I get easily distracted, and I also get anxious about not knowing what to say next, so I use the time when I should be listening to think about something to say. Although I do admit I have room for improvement on this area, I have been actively working on it, and I hope that I continue to become a much better listener. So you have some key things here he talks about. He doesn't want people to think he doesn't care. That's one. He wants to learn, getting other perspectives, and that he gets distracted, right? He talks a little bit about being anxious, the anxiety of thinking about what to say next. This is a very common experience. And yet he really focuses in on what is going on. And so this part about getting easily distracted, that could have been part of this paragraph, but it's okay. I mean, as long as he identifies clearly what's going on in the first paragraph, the significance becomes all tied in. And I don't really, we don't want to split hairs on this. Really, really clear what the significance is to him as a person. And that gives you a sense of what we're looking for. And this, I would say, is an A, almost A+ paragraph. Again, some grammar hiccups, but nothing major. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we're looking for with the journal. And depending on which journal you're doing, in this case, it's a leadership journal, pay attention to the time frames we're talking about. Make sure you make notes for yourself along the way each week at the end of every class or during the class. And believe me, it will speed things up a lot. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to discuss them with you further so that you can be successful. Bye for now.